Hello! Today's video takes a look at how to structure your answer in the English literature paper for AQA, and the text that you're looking for, hopefully I'll remember to put a link down below in the description, is Insight Extract to Whole. And this is a rather useful resource to tell you what the examiner is expecting from you in the exam. So what I'm going to show you is relevant to paper 1 of the literature exam, and it's relevant to both your Shakespeare play and your 19th century novel. In each case, students are provided with an extract from the text, and you're always asked to show your evidence of understanding of the whole text. And so I'm going to show you different ways of doing that will keep AQA happy. That skill is also introduced in Paper 2, Section B, where students respond to a studied cluster of poetry. The printed poem can act as the equivalent of an extract to be the focus for their close textual analysis, and their choice of comparison poem acts as the whole, showing their wider understanding of the cluster. Now, that's quite interesting. The chances are you haven't been taught that explicitly. So when you bring that comparison poem in, you do it, if like my students, you're studying power and conflict, for example, to show your understanding of the issues and themes of power and conflict presented in the cluster. Although it's just as easy just to focus on the second poem in its own right. But the fact that most students won't be thinking about the whole cluster shows that this is an easy way to get into the examiner's head and show that you fully understood the whole, the anthology as a whole. So you would be talking about how this other poem you compare it to represents the ideas in the anthology as a whole. Okay, this is a slightly difficult thing for me to recommend as a teacher of English, because assessment objective 1 asks you to do a skill which actually isn't an English skill, and it's I'll show you as we go through. They want you to have a critical style, which basically means you look at more than one point of view. You have a way of interpreting. You put forward an argument. Well, that's fine. You can see how you'd put forward an argument by starting your essay with the thesis, the view that you want to put forward. For example, in Macbeth, Shakespeare is trying to illustrate that Macbeth's tragedy is not the supernatural influence of the witches, it's his own pathological desire to please his wife and to realize his own ambitions to be king. And you don't have to have that view, by the way. You come up with any view, but that's what the thesis means. You come up with a point of view at the beginning, and then the rest of your essay is developed to try and prove that point of view. But the second part of the objective asks you to have an informed personal response. And the way that AQA interprets that is they ask you to say, I think, in my opinion. And actually, good English students don't do that. We train you to speak authoritatively, like an expert, and therefore use the passive voice, not putting I and you, I think, and your own opinion in it as I. But you'll see later that the examples that AQA give are to put I in. I'll deal with that problem when we get to it later. Use textual references and quotations. Well, obviously, you'll be familiar with that. So they want you to be able to quote, to summarize ideas in the text, paraphrase when you can't remember a quotation, which is good news. You don't have to remember a million quotations for each text, particularly useful in the poetry. But they love this, the idea of having single word quotations where you embed. And most of my videos show you exactly how to do that. So these can all be powerful ways in which to support responses in closed book context. The second objective, assessment objective, is to analyze the language and the form and the structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects. using relevant subject terminology. So they don't want to know that every single word is a verb or an adjective. They only want you to use that terminology where it's relevant to a point you're making. So, for example, um, if you're looking at a simile, why that particular simile? Let's just jump in though and look at what the examiner's thinking. What they want you to do is think about the writer's craft. That means, why does the writer put this detail here rather than at the beginning or at the end or anywhere else? Why is it here? And that will always hit the structure point that you want to make. So if you're thinking about the crafting, why is it here? And the second part of the crafting, uh, the form, is quite easy. Why has the writer chosen to write this in the form of a play instead of a novel? Um, and so you can talk about the immediacy of the shared experience. And it only has to be a single line about the form. You don't have to dwell on it. Um, if you're studying Jekyll and Hyde and you mention it's a novella, um, that's probably enough, or that its structure is not chronological in order to increase the level of suspense of the reader. That one line is enough to show that you're answering that part. How the writer has communicated meanings to the reader, and it's the meanings that they're most interested in. Notice meanings here are plural. That means the examiner wants you to have more than one interpretation. So Shakespeare might mean this, but on the other hand, he might mean that. And that's always more sophisticated and will always get you higher marks. And if we just scroll up again to AO1, you'll notice that that same skill of having more than one meaning is reflected with having more than one interpretation. So again, the examiners are after you thinking about more than one way of interpreting a character or an idea or the author's purpose. AO3 is all about context, so the relationship between texts and the context in which they were written. Now, the problem in the old AQA was that students used to write lots of stuff about when the text was written, but never make that relevant to the question, so they just lost loads of marks. To get round this, to get you to get more marks, they've made context less important, so it only counts as 50% of your overall grade. However, you shouldn't think of context that way. If we go back to AO1, if I want to write about interpretations, it's really useful for me to have an interpretation that people at the time, the contemporary readers, would have had. Yes, so I might be able to write about how contemporary readers of, contemporary audience members of Macbeth would have viewed witchcraft as a real evil. However, there's also the contextual detail that King James wrote his book about witchcraft, demonology, because many intellectuals were starting to doubt the existence of witches. So I can easily use my context to write about the interpretations. In fact, what I would say is that's the only time to use context, to link it to an interpretation. Well, when I do that, I'm not really fussed about whether context counts for 15% or 90%. It doesn't matter, because interpretations will count for 100%. Why? Because each time I have an interpretation, I quote. Each time I have an interpretation, I'm going to refer to single words. That's what the whole of assessment objective 1 is. So I'm going to get all of the assessment objective 1 marks when I start dealing with interpretations and using context to help me. That doesn't mean I have to refer to context all the way through, but it does mean that every time I mention context, it's always going to be relevant to AO1. Well, let's have a look at AO2 and see if it will always be relevant there. Well, when a writer chooses a particular structure, that will always be relevant to the audience at the time. So, Macbeth is written as a play because that's the main form of public entertainment at the time in London. That's that's why he's chosen the form of a play. He structured it as a tragedy because that's the dominant structure of plays that are being performed at the time in 1605 and 1606 and 1607. Tragedy was the major form that people were paying their money to go and see plays in the theatre. If I'm writing about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, well, that complex structure that's non-chronological, not linear, where we find out different parts of the past in the wrong order, is because Victorian readers craved thinking hard about their books. Reading books was their main form of entertainment. So it's easy to use context to get everything in AO2 as well. And obviously, if AO3 is about context, I'm going to get all of those marks. So really what I'm saying here is that context is your most important tool in choosing the right quotations and interpreting enough meanings to get the top marks. So hopefully you understand the assessment objectives well, and you can see why context and understanding the context that the text was written in is going to be your most useful tool in accessing the top marks. In my next video in the series, I'll look at how the examiners create their questions in order to help you get more marks. You might not have thought of examiners that way, but that's actually what they're trying to do. They want as many people as possible to get as many marks as possible. So do subscribe if you're interested in that, and watch out for the next video. Thank you for watching.